in the development of the Code of Good Governance for sport associations in Poland, and then later on in the implementation of that code, especially on the education side. And later on, I've been in charge of a reform in the Polish Cycling Federation, one of the federations that was facing the largest issues among the Polish sport federations. So this involvement has been both on government side and on the sports movement side. So I have those very different perspectives on how sport organizations are operating and how we can work together to make the necessary changes in the sport sector. So I'm going to talk briefly about India's Olympic aspiration, then move to governance, what it is, and what sort of issues are we facing on the global scale, and a little bit on what I've learned about India and its governance issues in the past. Then I will talk a little bit about different governance models and how globally we see approach to changes of those governance models in the past 2 decades. And then I will move for a moment to the Sport Governance Act of 2025 and briefly mention where I see some areas that are very strong in this act, and where then I will move to reforms and what are the potential points to consider while implementing those reforms, and what sort of issues we've seen countries were facing when implementing sport governance reforms. And then I'll have some conclusions and probably we'll have some time for questions if there will be some. So to start, India is bidding for the 2036 Olympic Games, which is a very large endeavor, and to be considered for such an event, which is the largest sporting event in the world, you have to have this capacity, which is a sport ecosystem capacity. It's not a very narrow area that we are considering, but it is rather broad. So making sure that the entire sport ecosystem is ready for such an event is key. So Olympic Games are a catalyst. So we see that countries that organize Olympic Games have social understanding and government understanding of a need for investment, because there is a need to build infrastructure, sporting infrastructure as well, but the majority is outside of sports, transportation, logistics, etc., which drives the growth of the GDP. very strong aspect of hosting the games is also nation building and how we unite as the hosting nation around the games, and how that influences as well sport participation, which is very often put forward. But with sport participation, we need to make sure that we are actually focusing our activities on making people participate in sport, in building this mindset, but also institutions around that, because it doesn't really happen just like that. We host games and people participate in sport, and we've seen a lot of research that showed this a little bit dynamic path that nations have to take in order to achieve that sport participation. But it is also building soft power, and this is something that in this turbulent world that we are living is a very strong part of the decision to host large-scale sport events. When we look at India's pathway, it is not necessarily the most straightforward one, but recently we've seen the successful bid for 2030 Commonwealth Games. That is definitely a big milestone into hosting Olympic Games, as well as having this experience of hosting other big events, multi-sport events, is always helping. But there is one thing that we've seen being mentioned around India's bid, and this is sports system that is in a need of reform. And that brings us to the topic of the largest part of my presentation, which is governance issues. And what is governance? To start with, a simple definition. Myself being an academic, I have this tendency to use very precise definitions, but I think for this type of presentation, it is much rather the simple definition that people can really grasp easily, that makes the most of sense. So in a very simple form, governance is how decisions are made and how organizations control and direct their operations. And this, when we look at governance, this is, we have to take sort of a helicopter view, all right? So we are moving at the top of our organization, and we look from above at everything that is happening. So we are referring to the values of the organization, what we think we should be doing, why we are doing this, and how we expect those all the activities of our organization, and in this case, the sport ecosystem, to operate. And also, importantly, how we don't want it to operate. So in the past few decades, sport has been facing a lot of issues. And I'm pretty sure you're aware of numerous corruption scandals, doping, lack of transparency, to put it mildly, that many sport organizations at various levels, from the IOC to sport clubs, have been facing. And some of them were also related to the Olympic Games directly. And so we've seen pressure on the Olympic movement to take some actions. Secondly, sport, and in the past, was predominantly based on voluntary activities. And for that reason, there were resources were scarce, and people who were in charge of those organizations not necessarily had the necessary skill set to run them in an efficient manner. And the structures were obsolete, having in mind the changes that the sport sector faced. Even from the education perspective, we've seen sport management being rather unpopular field of research and education at universities, which further contributed to those issues. And then we've seen questioning the legitimacy of the sport ecosystem. So sport, for especially Olympic sport, were given autonomy. So the freedom to structure themselves, to put together laws, and to govern themselves independently from any external oversight, which is very unusual in the entire economy and social structure. This position of the sport movement is particular. So there is a lot of, with that autonomy, there came a pressure for reforms, because sport organizations, sport ecosystem, the Olympic movement has started facing criticism to an extent that maybe this autonomy of sport is already a token of the past. And then we have a very big part of athletes' vulnerability and exclusion from decision making, and how athletes, as a very strong stakeholder within the sports movement, we often say that without athletes there is no sport movement, because what would we be watching? So moving forward, preparing for this presentation and previously analyzing how governance things are in India, I came across a few analyses, and I think there were a few key issues that sport governance in India is facing. Inefficient structures with long-standing rulers, and what I mean by that is that, and this is not necessarily something that is happening only in India, right? This is something that we've seen across the entire sport movement. So, as I mentioned before, how sport was structured was created to not necessarily to act in this modern world that is relatively dynamic, that has the population growth that is enormous. And so serving that many people it just requires different approaches and different tools. But also not having those regulations in place allows people to control sport organizations for many years, sometimes for their entire lifetimes. And this is causing problems. Even if we have the best person, the brightest person, the most educated person running an organization, after some time, they just fall into a routine, and they see the organization from a particular perspective, and that's why it's important to have those limits in how long you can run a sport organization. Then we had numerous legal issues, and I just focus on just few key points here, not to go too much into details, because I'm pretty sure your understanding of what are governance issues, what have been the governance issues in your sports sector are quite good. So, and probably this will be discussed also throughout the conference, and why do we need this governance reform. We've seen suspensions of national sport federations by the international ones due to lack of compliance to the international rules. And we've seen a lot of cases of athletes' vulnerability in the sport system. So that's why there has been a pressure for reform, and this pressure for reform is actually happening all around the world. So we see this in the entire sporting movement. And I will now go to this comparative analysis of how we see what was happening around the world around this governance change. So number one trend in governance was, we've seen the entire sporting movement being under severe pressure, right, for reforms. And in many countries, this pressure materialized in bringing something that is called codes of good governance. So this is something that we've seen in businesses as a response to many misconducts, especially in 1970s, 1980s. We've seen business organizations not acting, or people within those organizations not acting as the society would expect them to do. But also that was the moment where we've seen liberalization of legal pressures. So what was the response? Was creation of codes of good governance for businesses, and initially in the United States, to provide tools for those organizations to act more ethically, to act to receive social legitimacy, because the way they behaved was not acceptable by the society. And we've seen a similar trend at the beginning of 2000s in the sports sector. Initially happened in Europe, but then spread it throughout the world. And we've seen first in the Netherlands in 2005, and then most of the countries that decided to go this pathway was having a code implemented mainly in 2010s. And now in Europe, we have 9 countries that introduce code of good governance, but the entire ecosystem of sport in Europe is actually addressing the question of sport governance in different ways, mainly by restructuring their legal system, implementing new legal frameworks. But this trend of the codes is something particular because most of those documents are non-legally binding documents. So this is the case that is a little bit different from the path that India took. And this is usually a set of recommendations coming from either the government or the Olympic Committee, the National Olympic Committee, of how the organizations within that country should operate. And then, first of all, when we compare those reforms or those legal frameworks, there are major differences in what we consider in good governance. And usually we are referring to certain values or to certain abstract notions that we should incorporate in our operations, in our structures, in our ecosystem. And very often when we look at governance, we tend to have certain dimensions like democracy, transparency, social impact, or accountability. And this is one part, I would say one group of approaches to governance reforms. And we've seen that in codes, for example, in Poland, the first code in the Netherlands, the first code in the United Kingdom was focusing on those abstract dimensions of governance. So we grouped certain principles, how to operate, and we gave particular examples related to those domains. And then I would say in the late 2010s or early 2020s, we started looking at governance in a little bit different way. So we started focusing on the process. So how particular part of the organization, like the board, the General Assembly, etc., should operate. So we focused more on the process rather than on some abstract concepts that we've seen difficult to relate to in the sport movement. And then going back to those particular reforms, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands updated their codes of good governance for sport federations in the UK 2021 and the Netherlands 2022 to focus on those processes rather than the rules. And this is a particular shift in the mindset, I would say, because we started noticing that if we go too abstract in those reforms, if we start talking to people in terms that they are not really used to, it is rather difficult to make some significant changes in the way they operate, in the way they approach things. That's one thing. Second thing is when we looked at those governance models changes, those two countries that were actually rather successful in the implementation, they had high level of support for national governing bodies and in their so sports federations, and they had their dedicated contact people, and they had a lot of tools for supporting those organizations in their reforms. They had this comply or explain approach, which is if I'm doing something that is in line with the code, it's good. If I'm not doing it, I have to explain why I'm not doing it, because not every organization is the same, right? So there are particular particularities of every organization, and that can lead us to problems. So we don't want every single organization to be the same. This is rather impossible. They vary in size, they vary in structure, they vary in resources. So sometimes some things, and they have some historical elements that predetermine certain activities. So sometimes it just doesn't make sense to make everything universal. And then in recent years, we've seen a very strong component of education. So it's not only that we put together a set of rules and we help those organizations to implement them, and we check if they are doing it, but we are also providing additional resources, first as knowledge. We've seen the creation of the Sport Governance Academy in the United Kingdom. In Poland, we had Academy of Sport Management funded by the government, focused on providing this necessary knowledge and skills to sport administrators in order to facilitate those reforms. And this is, I will come back to it later on, but this is something that we've seen as a good practice in other countries as well, in Australia. Then we have a different model in Europe, that is Scandinavia. So we have a few countries in the north of Europe that usually that are actually showing the highest standards of governance in sport, across Europe in different frameworks of research. And they have no particular legal framework for governance in sport, but they have legal frameworks for governance in non-governmental organizations. And this is actually working very well as well in the sports world, because otherwise sport organizations are usually having this autonomy that I mentioned. So they have this possibility to operate as they see fit. But within that context, there is this legal framework that is more broad, that is actually also strongly pushing sport organizations to comply. Looking at the world, how is it working? So in the UK, we have UK Sport, which is a government body that oversees the entire board. Then it has smaller national branches in different parts of the UK, but I think that would be too technical. It provides funding to sport federations, but as I mentioned, they introduced a code for sport governance, and they recently, 4 years ago, made an amendment of that code. And one thing that is particular for the United Kingdom is that they have tiers based on the size of the organization. So when we look at sport ecosystem, we see that there are many organizations that are large. They have a number of employees, and they have very advanced structures. But there are also those organizations that are very little. They operate on the time and skills of the volunteers, and those different sizes sometimes are very difficult to compare. And so in the United Kingdom, we have different regulations. The regulation is actually the same, but the level of compliance that is required for large and medium and small sized sport organizations are different. But one thing that is that we see is that there is a high level of scrutiny from the society, from the government that is funding sport organizations, and also from the athletes. Right? So the governance reforms that we see in the UK are very dynamic, right? So this is part of the global trend, and those reforms actually started before the London Olympic Games in 2012. We have basic universal principles of good governance of the Olympic and sport movement. That is a document developed in 2008, and it was also a response to external pressures that the Olympic movement was facing, related to Olympic bids, related to misconduct in international federations and the IOC itself, but also again questioning the autonomy of sport. So in order to help the member organizations address this external pressure, there were those basic universal principles were developed and built around the Olympic values, but also around what is important in sport. That the sport is clean, that we don't have doping, that the sport is accessible, that people do not feel excluded from sport on any basis, that organizations are acting in a responsible and socially positive manner. And so this was part of a larger reform of the Olympic movement that was later on put together in strategic documents. And right now we are in the process of revising the latest strategic document, Agenda 2020+5, of the International Olympic Committee, with the new president of the IOC. And then probably in the near future, we'll see a new strategic document, and perhaps this aspect of governance will be then as well even more visible. Then Australia, we have the Australian Sport Commission that is also providing a lot of funding for federations, but it allows them to manage themselves. So we have this autonomy, but as again, this global trend is there, and we've seen issues in Australian sport as well. There is good governance. There are good governance principles that sport federations have to adopt to receive funding. And one thing that is provided is education. And this education is key. It is also the Australian Sport Commission is also providing external consultants to facilitate those reforms, to build that competence within those organizations, but also to use shared resources among sport federations to elevate them. And then we have the Canadian model, which is at elite level, it's federally funded. Canada being a federal state, it's there is a very big part of sport that is under provincial and territorial level. So there are those differences in how we can reform a system that has very fragmented legal structures. So we've seen the Code of Good Governance first introduced by the Canadian Olympic Committee and then adopted by Sport Canada, so the federal body for sport in Canada. But then now there is a process of trying to adopt it in different provinces and territories, because it's not necessarily the authority of the federal government to impose certain things on provinces. But in order to receive funding, now with the new strategic framework, the Canadian Sport Policy 2025, so the new strategic outlook for the next 5 years, there is this idea of keeping governance reforms as one of the key elements in that framework. So why good governance trends? And I'm slowly going towards the end of my presentation. There has been a strong pressure on the sports sector from the organizations that are giving the most of the finances to the sport movement, which is the governments and the sponsors. Right? So government is usually willing to support projects or activities that are beneficial for the society. And so sport started also showing that it has some negative aspects. And that's why the good governance reform trend was put together by the governments because the need was there, the issues were there, and the autonomy of sport was one of the reasons why there was no direct path to reform this ecosystem, right? So on one hand, we see this autonomy that sport wants to keep, but on the other hand, we need legitimacy. So if we want to keep the autonomy, we need to show as the sport movement that we can actually govern ourselves, that we are not the bad guy, right? That we can do it. And some countries decided to put additional pressure. Some sponsors decided to show, okay, you need to comply with our rules of corporate sponsorship or our code of good governance in order to receive funding. And also the IOC, as sort of the umbrella organization of the sport movement, put pressure on the alignment with good governance principles and on modernization of the structures in order to be more prepared to answer the modern world sport. Briefly on Sport Governance Act 2025. Definitely it is well designed and it provides solutions to broad range of problems and organizational frameworks. And this is something that we've seen happening in the world in the past. We've seen frameworks or reforms that were addressing very little. And here we see that the approach is broad. It is addressing key governance issues that were visible in India, and some of them I mentioned, some of them I didn't, but I'm pretty sure you know about that well. And one thing that I've seen has been under the discussion is the National Sports Board, and where I see some positives there is that it is having such an authority on a country level is solving certain problems. We see sport organizations having this autonomy. Sometimes only having international organizations overseeing that is not enough. And we've seen that in numerous countries that were imposing reforms, that sometimes there were national organizations saying, or the government saying, we see that there is a major problem in governance. We see that there is fraud. We see that there are people who are doing bad things in those organizations, but we have no tools to actually change that. And this is a situation that is in a long term detrimental for sport, because international sport organizations are very often putting together this notion that national federations are independent and that they are not interfering in those. And so sometimes we see a situation where there is no move. And having this national sport board, I see, will have this potential to act in a situation that we have no other possibility to move. But we have a governance issue that is very, that is actually threatening the existence of the organization. Speaking from experience, myself being the president of the Polish Cycling Federation in the past, we've had actually this type of issue in Poland, and still we couldn't move with the federation. We couldn't solve the problems internally, but we didn't have any external possibility to change it either. So the organization is still in sort of precarious position, not being able to operate, but also not having any external body to help with the reform. A big part is giving athletes their voice and participating in the decision-making process, and this is also a global trend. We've seen that in the U.S. recently with the NCAA and how athletes were getting more control and more share of the financial resources within the organization. I think this is also part of what's happening with the act. And then having in mind this balance between what we can solve, what we can control on the national level, and how is that important for our particular sport ecosystem, in this case in India, and not having external organizations being the only decision maker in that. I think this balance is very important. Having some tools to control the ecosystem, but also having the possibility of the international sport sector still keeping the autonomy. That balance is very important. So when it comes to governance reforms and what we've seen around the world, that was because I know that this is a long path. It's not going to happen over time. It's not going to happen this year that the entire reform is going to happen, right? So sport organizations have limited resources. And this has been the biggest issue with implementation of governance reforms that we've seen. So what we need is first, where we are lacking is usually people, knowledge, structures, information technology, and financials. And I'm not only talking about having the financials, having the means, but also how we manage them, how we account for them. Very big issue with governance reforms is the status quo trap. There's organizations, people have this tendency to keep the status quo, right? So bringing this reform and the Sport Governance Act is relatively major reform, is going to cause unwillingness to change. So overcoming that status quo trap is going to be very important in the implementation of that legislation. Then something that going around the world and talking with sport federations. Recently, I went to one of the developing countries in southern Europe, and they said that their only problem is money in changing things. I said, yeah, I see that everywhere, but actually with more money, usually we see more problems if we just add money. So usually that financial constraint comes as an excuse. But having said that, if we add some particular financial means, financial incentives to help the reform, it's usually working very well. And we've seen that in numerous countries that were implementing governance reforms, that this was working. And those were usually not very large incentives. It were sometimes even a token of gratitude. And then something that, speaking from experience in Poland with governance reforms in sports sector, clear implementation strategy is key. So where those reforms fail very often is where we only focus on having the legal grounding for the reform, and that's it. It's not going to magically happen. The governance research around the world right now, in the past 20 years, governance research in sport was focusing on the what should be done, the governance codes, and so on. What we are focusing now is the implementation, how we make this happen. Because we've seen the trend is there for the past 20 years. We've seen a lot of codes happening, but how do we translate them to the reality of the sports sector? This is the key. So there are global trends that push sport organizations to reforms. And there is no other way, because sport is like any, with many other areas of the economy, we've seen that those areas had to reform to show that they are positive for the society. And Sport Governance Act of 2025 is a good start of that. Right? Still, it's a legal tool. What's important is to have the implementation, providing the education. The education is extremely important. If we want people to do something in a new way, they have to know that this new way exists and how to do it. Cooperation on different levels, on different areas. Academia, I'm very happy that this conference is happening in the academic world, but it is bringing together stakeholders from the sports sector, from the government, from the local authorities, students as well. So this cooperation on different stakeholders, different levels is crucial. And then support. So not only expecting that things are magically going to happen, but also having this different ways of providing resources. The multi-level implementation, if we only do it in one level, it's not going to change much. It needs to go deep into the ecosystem. It's the ecosystem of sport because it's interconnected. Yeah, and all of that is helping us to develop the social aspect of sport. That is actually why we do sport. So if you would like to see, we've done research on sport governance in the past, and there are some practices of how sport organizations implemented certain areas of good governance in their operations, in their structures, and that might help. And a few years back, I think, already 4 years ago, we put together with some colleagues this book, Sport Governance Insights, that is very much down to earth handbook of what is governance in sport and how we can make it operational in sport organizations. There are some examples of different levels of implementation of governance. I thought that this may come handy to you. All right, so thank you very much for your attention. That's the entire presentation. If you would like to contact me, this is my email address, and also on LinkedIn. It's usually the best way to get in touch. And I'm also on this account and at LinkedIn, I'm also sharing quite a lot of insights into reforms on governance, into how things should be going, and also some of the work that I'm doing within the European Union, within the sport sectors on governance and innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greg, for that comprehensive and insightful presentation. The floor is now open for your questions. Anyone from the audience?
Hi, Greg. Can you see us?
Yes, I can hear you.
So before we go for the question answer, I would like to inform the audience that Greg couldn't make it this time to India because he is blessed with a baby girl. And congratulations, Greg. And despite a sleepless night, he took effort to take this session. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. So any questions now?
Hello. Am I audible, Greg?
Hello, sir. Good morning, sir. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. I would like to ask what are the codes you have mentioned about the sports governance, how they are effective in the country like India, and how we can customize them, and how the motivation of the sports fraternity and other stakeholder is there. Because since people used to go on the higher side, they go to Olympics and all. So the governance is not coming down on the ground side, at ground level. So what is the motivation? How you would like to motivate all the stakeholders for the good governance at grassroots level? One thing is that, and how the codes which are being, as you mentioned, Sports Act 2025, effective in India as per your views. Thank you.
I'm very sorry, but the sound that I'm getting from the microphone is very it's not easy to understand. So I didn't really understand the question.
Can you please repeat your question?
Motivation for all the stakeholders in the sports and the allied stakeholders for the good governance, which make effect on the grassroots level. First thing is this, and second is he has mentioned about the Act 2025 about the good governance. How is that effective in our country? How we can codify in our country?
Sorry, I think there is some issue with my.
Is it audible now?
You're not audible, Greg.
Better now. Or perhaps you could type it in the chat, and then I could answer.
Greg, is it okay now? Am I audible?
Yeah, I'm hearing you, but there is a lot of sort of background noise here from the speaker. Can't really understand well.
Can I write the question on WhatsApp? Can you would you be able to check it now?
Yes. Okay. So the bureaucracy and those differences. So I think you know, there are always some particularities of how every system works, and yeah, definitely the largest. I think the largest difference is the size of the population, right? It's different when you are implementing a reform in a country of 40 million people and in a country of 1.4 billion people. So just, you know, having one state being the size of Poland or few times larger in terms of population and in the landmass, this is creating issues. And just recently, I've been doing last academic year a comparative analysis of sport policy and governance implementation in Poland and in Canada, and having the same population, around 40 million, in Poland and Canada, Canada being 30 times larger in terms of the area that it covers than Poland. The key issue was the accessibility, right? So how we can access resources, how people can access sport. But second thing, how is the division of power between the federal level and then the provincial levels, which I think could be compared to India, the country level, and then the states. Those differences and this division of power and then compliance on and changes, particularities of different areas, those will differ. And those will be, for sure, a big question for how we can approach the reform. And this should be taken into consideration. So one thing is looking at the issues that other countries were facing is very helpful. Second thing is how our country, how our sport ecosystem is different and also bringing lessons learned from other areas of the economy. So sport is one particular thing, but we for sure have seen reforms being implemented in other areas, and having those lessons learned from those other areas brought into this reform can be very beneficial.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for the question. We'll be moving forward now. Greg, can you hear me? Greg? Greg, am I audible?
Hi, Greg, can you hear us?
Yes?
All right. So thank you so much, Greg. This is the challenge which we usually face when it comes to the virtual mode. But anyways, I think for the third session, please do not plan anything, right? And you have to be here for the third edition of the conference. And by the way, for the audience, Greg was also the part of the first International Olympic Research Conference, and this is the second time he is here with us, but again virtually. So Greg, do not plan anything, okay? I'm telling you 1 year in advance. And you know it, what I
Okay.
mean.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
It was
Greg.
a pleasure sharing some of the insights with you, and I hope it will be beneficial for making some sense of why do we need governance reforms in the sports sector, and how this can benefit the entire society, and also contribute to India's success in the 2036 bid that I'm keeping my fingers crossed to that your country receives this event.
So, yes, since a lot of mega events are going on in India, a lot of mega events are planned ahead in India. Sports governance is something which is very well actively taken care of, and that is why we have included in the session. And I hope that the work which we have started will finish it soon, and that will help the aspirations of India as well. So thank you so much for the session. We have got something already for you. So I request Mr. Yash Sharma to. So if you see.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really appreciate. So.
And